When Jonathan Roumie walked into the Cook County Courthouse in Chicago as a simple witness, he never imagined he'd become the target of a vicious spiritual attack, a public crucifixion of his faith broadcast for the world to see. What started as testimony about a stolen locket quickly turned into a brutal assault on his deepest beliefs, his faith, and his spiritual connection to the sacred. Judge Harrison Blackwood tore into his soul with surgical precision, using his most sacred experiences as weapons to humiliate him before millions. But when he crossed that final, unforgivable line, something awakened in Jonathan that the world had never seen before. His response didn't just defend himself. It changed how millions of people think about faith, dignity, and the power of quiet strength. It was a cold Tuesday morning in Chicago when Jonathan Roumie found himself in the most unlikely place imaginable, the waiting room of Judge Harrison Blackwood's courtroom, not as a celebrity guest or for a promotional appearance, but as a reluctant witness in a small claims case that had somehow entangled him in its web. The case, on its face, was simple enough. Elena Petrova, an elderly Ukrainian housekeeper who had worked for the wealthy Albright family for 20 years, was being sued by the home's new owner, a young real estate developer named Carter Vance, for allegedly stealing a gold locket. Elena claimed the locket was a retirement gift from her previous employer. Mrs. Albright, and Jonathan, a close friend of the Albright family, was the only person who could verify her story, having been present when the gift was given. Jonathan sat quietly in the corner of the waiting area, wearing his typical understated outfit jeans, a simple black t-shirt, and a worn leather jacket. He'd tried to keep his appearance low-key, but his presence hadn't gone unnoticed. Other litigants whispered and pointed, some taking discreet photos with their phones. Is that really him?" a young woman whispered to her friend. "I think so." "But what's he doing here?" came the hushed reply. Jonathan pretended not to hear, focusing instead on the book in his hands, a worn copy of C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. Reading had always been his refuge, a way to find peace in chaos. But today, even Lewis's wisdom couldn't calm the growing unease in his chest. The show's producer, a sharp-eyed woman named Sharon, had briefed him earlier about the show's format. "Just answer the questions directly," she'd said. "Judge Blackwood likes straightforward responses. No Hollywood storytelling." But there was something in Sharon's tone that suggested this appearance might be more complicated than a simple witness testimony. The way she'd looked at him, like he was an exotic animal in a zoo, had set off alarm bells. Elena Petrova sat across from him, her weathered hands trembling slightly as she clutched the manila folder containing what little evidence she had. At 73, she'd spent her life cleaning other people's homes, sending money back to family in a distant homeland, asking for nothing more than respect and fair wages. Her eyes carried the weight of a life lived abroad and the sorrow of a war tearing her country apart. "Mr. Jonathan," she said softly in accented English, "I am sorry you have to be here. I know you have important things to do." Jonathan closed his book and gave her his full attention. "Elena, there's nowhere else I'd rather be. You've been nothing but kind and honest. If I can help prove that, then this is exactly where I should be." The simple exchange was overheard by several people in the waiting room, and Jonathan noticed how some faces softened. Here was a famous actor, a man known for portraying Jesus, treating a housekeeper with genuine respect and kindness. Not for cameras, not for publicity, but because it was the right thing to do. Carter Vance, however, remained unmoved. The developer was a man in his 30s, with perfectly coiffed hair and an expensive suit that screamed new money. He'd been shooting disdainful looks at both Elena and Jonathan since arriving. "I don't care if he plays Jesus or not," Vance had told his lawyer loudly enough for everyone to hear. "The help stole from me, and I want justice." The casual cruelty in calling Elena the help made Jonathan's jaw tighten slightly, but he said nothing. He'd learned long ago that some battles were better fought with silence than with words. A production assistant appeared. "Vance versus Petrova. You're up!" As they filed toward the courtroom, Jonathan felt that familiar sensation he got before difficult scenes, a mixture of anticipation and dread. He'd faced down assassins in movies, saved the world from machines. But somehow, walking into Judge Harrison Blackwood's courtroom felt more daunting than any action sequence. Judge Blackwood was already at his bench, reviewing case files with the intensity of a prosecutor preparing for trial. He was smaller in person than he appeared on television, but his presence filled the room like a gathering storm. The courtroom was paneled in dark wood, the ceilings high, and the American flag stood solemnly behind his bench, all contributing to an atmosphere of severe authority. As Jonathan took his designated spot, he caught Judge Blackwood's eye for just a moment. There was something there, a glint of recognition mixed with what looked almost like anticipation. It wasn't the look of someone preparing to conduct a fair hearing. It was the look of a hunter who had spotted his prey. But what Judge Blackwood didn't know was that he was about to underestimate the quiet man standing before him. And in just a few minutes, his attempt to diminish him would backfire in ways that would shock millions of viewers worldwide. Judge Blackwood wasted no time establishing his dominance. He looked up from his papers, his expression that of someone who had already made up his mind before hearing a single word of testimony. "So," he began, his voice cutting through the air like a blade, "we have a housekeeper claiming a priceless locket was a gift. And now, the star of The Chosen has graced us from on high to vouch for the help." The word help dripped with the same disdain that Carter Vance had used, immediately setting the tone for what was to come. Jonathan noticed how Elena flinched at the term, her shoulders sagging slightly. "Your Honor," Elena's court-appointed representative began, "Mr. Roumie is here simply to verify—" "I wasn't talking to you," Judge Blackwood snapped. "Mr. Roumie, step forward." Jonathan moved to the center of the courtroom, his movements calm and measured despite the growing tension. He'd been in hostile environments before, but this felt different, more personal, more calculated. "So, you're here to testify that this woman," Judge Blackwood gestured dismissively toward Elena, "didn't steal a gold locket worth $15,000. "That's correct. Your Honor, I was present when Mrs. Albright, Elena's previous employer, gave her the locket as a retirement gift. I witnessed the entire—" "Oh, you witnessed it," Judge Blackwood interrupted with a laugh that had no warmth in it. "And I suppose in your world, housekeepers regularly receive $15,000 retirement gifts." The question was loaded, implying that Jonathan was either lying or so out of touch with reality that he couldn't distinguish between normal and absurd. "In my experience," Jonathan replied carefully, "Mrs. Albright was a generous woman who valued Elena's 20 years of loyal service." "Your experience," Judge Blackwood repeated mockingly. "And what exactly qualifies your experience in matters of domestic employment? Do you clean your own house? Mr. Roumie, do you know what normal people give their housekeepers when they retire? A card? Maybe a small bonus? Not jewelry worth more than most people make in a year." Jonathan felt the familiar sensation of being under attack. But this wasn't a movie where he could fight back with words or actions. This was Judge Blackwood's domain, and he was making it clear that his celebrity status not only wouldn't help him here, it would be used against him. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "I am simply testifying to what I saw." "What you think you saw," he corrected sharply. "Let me guess. You probably believe in all sorts of things that normal people would find questionable. The shift in his tone was subtle but unmistakable. Judge Blackwood was moving from professional skepticism to personal attack, and everyone in the courtroom could feel it. The room grew colder, not from the Chicago weather outside, but from the cruelty forming inside. The air grew thick, and Jonathan knew the trial over the locket was merely a prelude. The real battle was for something else entirely, a battle he hadn't prepared for, but one that, somehow, his entire life had been leading him to. "I believe in treating people with dignity and respect," Jonathan replied, his voice remaining steady despite the growing hostility in the room. Judge Blackwood let out another laugh, this time openly contemptuous. "Dignity and respect? How wonderfully philosophical. Tell me, Mr. Roumie, do you consider yourself a spiritual person?" The question seemed to come from nowhere, a sharp left turn from the facts of the case. Jonathan hesitated, sensing a trap but unsure of its nature. "Yes," he said, his voice measured. "I would say I have spiritual beliefs." "Spiritual beliefs," Judge Blackwood repeated, as if the words tasted foul in his mouth. "How nice. And do these spiritual beliefs include the rather unconventional ideas you've expressed in interviews, the ones about divine intervention, answered prayers, that sort of mystical nonsense?" The courtroom fell silent. Even Carter Vance looked surprised by the direction the judge was taking. This was supposed to be about a stolen locket, not a theological debate. "I fail to see how my personal beliefs are relevant to this case," Jonathan said, a hint of steel entering his voice for the first time. "Oh, they are relevant," the judge smiled, but it was a predator's smile. "They are supremely relevant because they speak to your credibility as a witness. If a man believes in fairy tales, how can we trust his perception of reality?" He leaned forward, his eyes glinting. "And let's be honest, your entire career is built on one of those fairy tales. Isn't it a story from some ancient desert tribe that you've managed to monetize quite successfully?" The insult was ugly and deeply personal, reducing centuries of faith to a tribal superstition. But Judge Blackwood wasn't finished. He turned his attention to the trembling woman sitting behind Jonathan. "This alleged gift," he continued, gesturing toward Elena, "was given right before the previous owner passed away. Correct? And you, Mrs. Petrova, are from Ukraine. There's a lot of trouble in that part of the world right now. Isn't there?" Elena nodded, confused and frightened by the question. "People get desperate in times of trouble," the judge mused, his voice dripping with insinuation. "Desperate people from desperate countries can be tempted to do desperate things. Perhaps they see an opportunity with a frail, dying woman and decide to call a theft a gift." The attack was now twofold, one prong aimed at Jonathan's faith, the other at Elena's nationality. He was painting a picture for the audience, a delusional actor and a desperate immigrant, colluding in a lie. Carter Vance, the plaintiff, nodded along with a smug look, his prejudice validated by the judge's authority. "This isn't about the facts," Jonathan stated, his voice now dangerously calm. "This is a character assassination. This is about establishing who this court can believe," Blackwood thundered, slamming his hand lightly on his desk. He picked up a file, clearly provided by his producer. "You've spoken publicly, have you not, about a time during a severe personal crisis when you felt a divine presence that gave you guidance. You described it as a moment of absolute clarity, a message from God himself." He looked up from the file, his eyes narrowed into slits. "Tell me, Mr. Roumie, is that what we're calling a grip on reality these days? A conversation with an invisible man in the sky?" How can this court trust the testimony of someone who admits to having hallucinations? The cruelty of the blow was breathtaking. Judge Blackwood had taken a profound, private moment of faith and twisted it into evidence of mental instability. He had weaponized Jonathan's spirituality for the entertainment of a television audience. Jonathan stood perfectly still, but something inside him shifted. The years of prayer, of meditation, of portraying a figure of immense grace under unimaginable pressure, all crystallized into a single point of silent, unshakable resolve. He was no longer just a witness defending a friend. He was a man standing watch over the very essence of his soul. Judge Blackwood, mistaking Jonathan's silence for defeat, leaned back in his chair, ready to deliver the final blow. "So what we have here," he said, addressing the camera as much as the court, "is a man who lives in a fantasy world of spiritual delusions, vouching for a woman from a desperate country who has every reason to lie. It's a sad, pathetic story." He paused for effect, his voice dripping with disdain. "But this court, Mr. Roumie, doesn't deal in fantasies from Hollywood actors or sob stories from immigrants. This court deals in facts, cold, hard facts." The attack was comprehensive and brutal. He had dismissed Jonathan as unstable and Elena as a liar, using their identities one of faith, one of nationality as the proof. The room was dead silent, the weight of the judge's verdict hanging in the air. He had just laid out his reality, his version of the facts. But as Judge Blackwood preened in his perceived victory, he failed to notice the change in the man before him. Jonathan Roumie slowly lifted his head, and the look in his eyes was no longer that of a victim. It was the look of a man who had just been handed a sword. "Then let's talk about the facts, Your Honor," Jonathan said, his voice quiet, yet carrying an authority that instantly seized control of the entire room. "May I present them?" Judge Blackwood blinked, taken off guard by the sudden shift in Jonathan's demeanor. He had expected a retreat, a stammered defense, not a challenge. "Present what, Mr. Roumie? More of your feelings?" "No," Jonathan said, his voice firm and clear. "Evidence." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. The entire courtroom leaned forward. The production crew, who had been lazily filming the judge's tirade, suddenly snapped to attention, their cameras zooming in on Jonathan's hands. "You see, Your Honor, after Mrs. Albright passed away," Jonathan began, his words deliberate and precise, "her son gave me a hard drive containing all their family photos and videos for safekeeping. He knew how much his mother treasured those memories. And on that drive—" He paused, tapping the screen of his phone. "Is the video from her retirement party." He turned the phone to face the plaintiff's table, where Carter Vance had gone visibly pale. "It's a 2-hour video, but I've bookmarked the relevant section. It shows Mrs. Albright making a speech, and in that speech, she holds up this very locket." Jonathan's gaze locked onto the judge. "She calls Elena her sister in spirit, her guardian angel in a world that had grown dark. And then, in front of a dozen witnesses, she places the locket around Elena's neck." The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Judge Blackwood stared at the phone as if it were a venomous snake. This evidence," he stammered, his mask of authority beginning to crack. "Why wasn't this presented initially?" "It was," Jonathan replied calmly, but his words landed like hammer blows. "It was submitted to your producers 3 weeks ago, along with sworn affidavits from 2 other party guests. I was told, and I quote, that it would make the case too open and shut, and that you preferred more dynamic television." A collective gasp went through the audience. The implication was monstrous. Judge Blackwood's show had deliberately suppressed exonerating evidence to manufacture a drama. They had sacrificed an innocent woman's reputation and ambushed a witness's faith for the sake of ratings. Furthermore, Jonathan continued, swiping on his phone again, I have the appraisal documents. The locket isn't worth $15,000. It's an antique, yes, but its monetary value is less than $500. Its true value was sentimental. Mr. Vance knew this. He received all of the estate's paperwork, including the appraisals. Carter Vance shot up from his chair. This is a lie, Is it? Jonathan's voice cut through him like a razor. Or is it true that you bought this historic home with the intention of tearing it down to build luxury condos? Is it true that you tried to evict Elena, the longtime housekeeper, with no notice? But she had a clause in her contract from Mrs. Albright guaranteeing her residency for life. And is it true that this lawsuit was nothing more than a malicious attempt to defame her character and create a legal pretext to break that contract? Every word was a perfectly aimed arrow, piercing through the layers of deceit. The case wasn't about a locket. It was about greed, real estate, and the brutal displacement of a vulnerable elderly woman. Judge Blackwood, his face a mixture of crimson and white, finally found his voice. Case dismissed, he croaked, slamming his gavel down with a weak thud. But Jonathan wasn't finished. He turned from the crumbling judge and the disgraced plaintiff to face the main camera, speaking directly to the millions who would be watching. Today, a man in a position of power used my faith as a punchline and a woman's nationality as proof of her guilt. He called my spiritual experiences hallucinations and her heritage desperate. He tried to make us small, to make us ashamed of who we are. He stepped toward Elena and gently helped her to her feet. The elderly woman was weeping, but now they were tears of vindication. But here is the real truth, Jonathan declared, his voice ringing with the quiet power that had captivated audiences around the world. Faith is not a delusion. It is the anchor that holds us in the storm. Hope is not a weakness. It is the fire that keeps us warm in the cold. And where you come from does not determine your worth. He looked directly into the camera lens, his eyes burning with an intensity that felt as if it could see into every home. He wanted to talk about cold. Hard facts. Here is one. The only fantasy here is the belief that you can strip a person of their dignity. The only delusion is the idea that power without compassion is anything other than cruelty. And the only desperation in this room belongs to those who must tear others down to feel tall. He placed a protective arm around Elena's shoulders. This woman is not a thief. She is a survivor. She is a woman of immense grace and strength. And she deserves not only our apology, but our deepest respect. As they turned to leave the courtroom, walking past a speechless Judge Blackwood and a humiliated Carter Vance, Jonathan offered one final thought. They tried to stage a crucifixion here today. They forgot one thing. He smiled, a small, knowing smile. Sometimes, the story doesn't end on the cross. The episode would air exactly as filmed, a raw and unfiltered record of a public takedown. Judge Blackwood's career was left in ruins, and Carter Vance faced a barrage of legal action for malicious prosecution. But for millions of viewers, the image that endured was that of a man who, when his faith was put on trial, refused to be broken. In defending an elderly housekeeper, Jonathan Roumie had defended everyone who had ever been made to feel small for believing in something bigger than themselves, and the world would remember. Thank you for following this story. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. If you'd like more inspiring stories about justice and resilience, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We'll be back tomorrow with another must-see story you won't want to miss.